Hello, thank you for coming to this research presentation. Today we'll be talking about how our group translated and culturally adapted the National Household Food Security Survey module into Vietnamese for the Vietnamese community in the US. To bring everyone to the same page in terms of language, we will use the acronym HFSSM instead of Household Food Security Survey module. First, we would want to begin by defining food insecurity. Food insecurity is a household measure in which all residents lack access to food in either quality, quantity, or cultural appropriateness due to restricted financial resources. The US uses the Household Food Security Survey module, or HFSSM, to monitor food security. Although HFSSM is the gold standard to measure food security in the US, it has only been validated in a few languages. Currently, the USDA uses two validated versions nationally, which are English and Spanish, and using the HSS. This slide shows food security status disaggregated by Asian origin. As you can see here, compared to other Asian origins, Filipinos and Vietnamese have the highest rates of experiencing food insecurity. But what about those who do not primarily speak English or Spanish? The data here is not captured. And so what we see here is not a complete scenario, and that is a problem. Data collection helps us identify food insecurity. We need an accurate understanding of food security to design a more effective food programs or food policies. In short, we cannot address food insecurity if we don't fully understand who is in need. And this is the case for the Vietnamese population in the US. Unfortunately, this issue is not new. Researchers have been trying to point out the national health surveys that tend to omit or misrepresent Asian Americans. And one of these reasons, the lack of language options on these surveys. While this pattern of data misrepresentation affects everyone who does not primarily speak English in the US, the Vietnamese faces the highest risk of all. How can we expect accurate survey data if the survey questions are not in the right language? And when there is a gap, there is an opportunity. Our food security research group challenged the use of language and culture as a catalyst for food security within this group, the translation team was responsible for translating and culturally adapting the HFSM into Vietnamese for our Vietnamese community in the US. Having covered the what, we would like to talk about the how. To accomplish that, we use several methods, and Andy will begin to explain each one.
Before we fully commit to translating and culturally adapting the HFSSM to Vietnamese, we reviewed the literature to look for any existing translations to avoid duplicating what was already done and to build on that as well. Essentially, we looked at relevant research to answer the question, has anyone fully translated and culturally adapted the food security survey into Vietnamese? Is there a gap in research there, and how do we close that gap? Next is forward translation. Myself and Man received trainings from Dr. Poplacion and Dr. John Cook, who was part of the team that validated the HFSSM for use in the US. Myself and Man then worked separately to translate the HFSSM to Vietnamese, producing Vietnamese versions A and B. The third step is reconciliation using the Delphi method. Essentially, we carried out 3 rounds of surveys to gather feedbacks from a group of language professionals. The language professionals graded the existing translations A and B using a score from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score. They were also able to suggest new translation options when appropriate, which was included in the following Delphi reconciliation rounds for their colleagues to evaluate. At the end of this process, the translation option with the higher scores, which are 4 or 5, from all language professionals, and without any significant critiques, were chosen to compose the final Vietnamese translation of the HFSSM. In other words, each HFSSM item now had the best translation. In the fourth step, we convert the final forward translation in Vietnamese back into English for the purpose of quality checking. Two external translators independently translated the Vietnamese version 2 back into English, hence why it's called back translation. Um, Ultimately, this gave us English back translation A and English back translation B. It is worth noting that these people had never seen the English HFSSM to ensure the fidelity on their translations. With these back translations, we can now compare them against the original English version of the HFSSM. This comparison helped reveal any potential glaring mistakes in the Vietnamese version 2. With our food security survey expert, Professor Poplacion, and our language expert, Professor Trang, we edited any glaring mistakes in the Vietnamese version 2, and the corrected translations are now version 3. But the goal is for the Vietnamese version to work with real people. So in the sixth and final step, we conducted qualitative interviews with our Vietnamese community members. We asked them to interpret our translations, give an example related to the phrase we gave, and we adjust our translation depending on their feedback. Now that I've explained the methodology, I will share the results for each step. The literature review showed that there was a gap, as no published research to our knowledge had ever been fully translated and culturally adapted the HFSSM into Vietnamese. To bridge this gap, we will use the HH3 item on the presentation, which reads, "The food that I/we bought just didn't last, and I/we didn't have the money to get more. Was that often, sometimes, or never true for you/your household in the last 12 months?"
And voila, we invited you to see the back translation in action. The first column is the original English version for us to compare again. And the second and third version, a column or Vietnamese version back translated by translator B, A, and B respectively, and they seem familiar, but there are several points that need further work. With the help of Professor Poplacion as the HFSSM expert and Professor Tran as a language expert, we compare and notice immediately a glaring mistake. The original English version conveys the idea of a household having no more food in the house due to financial hardship. This is what we had hoped for a Vietnamese, and then the English version would also convey. However, both bilingual translator A and B understood the item as food had been used quickly, or food bought is quickly running out. They thought that the Vietnamese item meant food being used faster than the person in the household expected, and that's not the way we wanted the Vietnamese translation to convey. So we fixed the Vietnamese item to put forward the idea of food completely out, more apparently, so the English translation of the correct Vietnamese version is closer to the meaning with the original HFSSM. Finally, in a cognitive interview, we asked a Vietnamese participant to interpret our corrected translation, and they gave the following answer: "No more food in the house due to lack of money." So this confirmed that our corrected translation was similar in the meaning with original HFSSM.
So you may ask, why the long and difficult process? Why not just Google Translate it? Well, that answer is only a test away. When you plug item HH3 into Google Translate, this is the Vietnamese, and the second column is the Vietnamese version that you would get. And to double check for any potential glaring mistake, you only need to convert that back into English again. And when you do, I would like to point you to this portion. The food that we bought is no longer usable. The original English version indicate the idea of being completely out of food, not completely out of expiration. So, in conclusion, we have two key points we want to share with you. First, there need to be a long and difficult process to ensure that nothing gets lost in translation. And two, while inaccurate translations affect all the groups, it will affect some groups, and particularly more than others. We therefore recommend that there needs to be more rigorous translation to capture the food security needs, especially among groups with high percentage of people with non-English language preference. This is the conclusion of our presentation. I would like to immensely thank Dr. Anna Popasion and Professor Chang Chung. But thank you so much for everyone being here.
Taking questions.
Thank you. This was so fantastic. My dad's a translator in Canada, so a lot of this really resonated. I'm wondering who administers this survey, and basically, if your version was to be sent out, which government agency or nonprofit would be sending it out? And do you think future work on this for other populations you mentioned, like the Filipino population, would be done by that agency, or do you see it more going towards like academia and folks like you?
Okay, so I'll answer with the best I know. So the survey currently has been culturally and statistically validated in 3 languages: English, Spanish, and Chinese. However, only the English and the Spanish version are currently being applied nationally by the U.S. Census Bureau through a larger survey called the Current Population Survey. And so the food security survey we present here is only a sub portion of that, right? So just want to provide some context here. So in order for this to be applied, we need to translate every sections, not just the food security sections alone. So this is part of very, very long work. So ideally, the rest of the subsections will be translated, and then the U.S. Census Bureau would apply it, right? But we're hoping also maybe a state or national organization would pick it up and apply this this version individually. So yeah.
Thank you all for sharing this. I think you made a really strong case for the urgency of these translations because food insecurity affects the Vietnamese population in the US, but also for the importance of taking a lot of care and time to get the survey right and accurate. So how do you think about balancing like the urgency versus the sort of care and rigor that needs to go into this work? Because it seems like kind of competing priorities.
I think like from a different perspective, it like complements each other because of how urgent it is. That's why we need to put even more care into it, because the more we rush it, right, that's going to have inaccurate data to work with and may even perpetuate the problem rather than solve it. So I think that the urgency actually justifies the care and the long process that goes into it.
Did you ever like test or consider the idea of like merging like assistive technology and then like manual translation as a way to like ease and like speed up the process? Or does that make sense? Like as a question, like kind of merging like something like Google Translate or another like automatic translator and then reviewing it by a human as like a way to like speed up the process.
I don't think we like explore that idea, to be honest, because a lot of the it seems pretty like straightforward from the way we present the method, but there's like a lot of intellectual thinking going into like each translation. And he knows this. There have been some nights, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of nuance in translations that I'm not sure assistive, technology may be able to assist. We need like someone who lives in that culture, who experienced that culture, have that rich experience to be able to translate it.
I just want to first start by saying congrats. I think this was a very, very successful project, and the amount of effort that was put into it, I think, is very apparent. I wanted to ask about kind of like the replicability of your project. So do you think that the way that you went about the translation is very replicable for other language communities? And what areas do you think your project could have improved in if this were to be replicated for a language community that is very underrepresented?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question about if any other group would be able to replicate it. The answer is in the next set of presentation, I promise. So I'll let them tell you that. I won't spoil everything. In terms of what could have done better, there's definitely something that could done better is the Delphi method. I feel like the Delphi method that we used, it was very, very difficult to set up, just because of for example, at one point we have 8 translation options for each item almost, and it was very unreasonable to ask language professionals who are already busy themselves to have 18 items, right? Each item have 8 translation options to go through and then provide thoughtful feedbacks on it. So something that could have done better is definitely engage with language professors and survey experts earlier in the process to filter out anything that was missing. Yeah.
All right, so we will be moving on to the next section of Man's presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Avi. I'm joined by Taylor and Zauchi. We're the program and policy team, and our research is on using the social ecological model to promote food security among the Vietnamese people in the US with non-English language preference.
Okay, so let's first start with the introduction. Let's start with definitions, where food insecurity is limited or uncertain access to nutritionally adequate and safe foods obtained in socially acceptable ways. The national survey data can inform and shape public policies, and like they said in the last presentation, HFSSM is the gold standard used to measure household food insecurity, and survey data should be available in multiple languages to ensure that groups with non-English language preference are included.
So we're one of 3 teams, and our goals are to promote food security resources among research participants and examine the impact of survey translation in food access.
For the research method, we use the social ecological model, a framework for examining how factors at various levels influence in health. So first, we compared resources at the national, state, and the local levels, noted if they had a Vietnamese interpretation or translation services. And we also contact a state-funded organization working to achieve food security and a MA elected official. Last, we collected several examples of the importance of in-language access in communities with non-English language preference.
So for our methods and findings / resource guide, here is our framework, and our framework was down to the individual. What did we do? We reviewed Children's Health Watch resource guide. We reviewed findhelp.org's resource guide. We created our own federal and local guides. We discussed considerations for Vietnamese language and translated all these materials to Vietnamese. And what did we find? We found that not all resources had Vietnamese language translation or interpretation services. So here's an example of our resource guide on a local level for senior services. It's very simplified, and there's the how to apply section and resource links. We also communicated with state-funded organizations and elected officials. We've connected with CHIS, the California Health Interview Survey leadership, and the Massachusetts State Representative, Viet Nguyen. And what did we find? We found that there's a need to address low response rates, and we referred to other organizations and agencies that could help support this work. And we also asked for advice for how to continue our research efforts beyond our current project.
So in addition to the resource guide and list and our communication, we also created a policy tracker. So a screenshot is provided on what that looks like, but we essentially identified news articles and reports on the impact of language translation and interpretation services on food accessibility across the US. And in doing so, we found that many communities actually led language accessibility efforts to ensure that community members with a non-English language preference could access food resources. So as we can see in the screenshot, we documented the region, the organizations that led this work, as well as a summary of what specifically they did.
We have the two main conclusions. The first one is in the future research project, we focus on in food insecurity, like create a resource list and a guide, and could further support the research participants. And also the impact of the survey translation and food accessibility may not be immediately, but this work is really crucial. Thank you so much. That's all our presentation.
One or two questions for the policy team.
The resource guide is really cool. Is there a way we can get access to that like now, or is that available, man? Or you gatekeeping it?
So we do have it like printed out. It just we didn't print out enough to give to everyone. That was the only issue. But I guess like we can like I can talk you through like the format that we did it in. We give like a summary of what the program is, the language accessibility of it, and then the additional links that participant can use. Those are then translated into Vietnamese so that the translation team, when they interview, during the cognitive interview, right, if participants identify themselves as food insecure, we can then refer them to these kind of resources. So yeah.
When you were looking for resources across the country, were there any places, like either county governments or state governments, that you found to be exemplary, that were kind of ahead of where the rest of the US was? I imagine something in California.
I'd say that the city of Boston really had a lot of like language accessibility. Like I feel like so at the city level, that was like an exemplary example. And then in terms of federal, it was kind of like it really depended on what the specific resource was, because for the federal level, what it most of the time ended up being was like a national hotline of some sort. And then with that hotline, they would be able to connect them with a translator that could help walk them through accessing those resources.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so we are the third team. This is going to be the toolkit team. It's going to be myself, Reina, and then Isabella, who is unfortunately unable to join us today. There was an emergency at the last second, but she's been just a massive, massive help throughout this whole process. So all thanks to her. Okay, so our toolkit team is focused mostly on the sustainable side of the project. To go back to your question earlier, how other groups can go about translating their own research and taking care of the household food security survey in their own communities for their own linguistic populations, we're creating the tools to make sure that those other groups, whether they be academic or cultural or student groups or whatever, have those resources, can learn from our triumphs and our mistakes and make those translations on their own. So how do we actually go about that? We've had two main roles as the toolkit team. First off is going to be the focus groups that we conducted throughout the past 2 semesters. So first one is going to be with a bunch of healthcare professional students over at the BU Medical Campus. Most of them were pre-public health or in the public health program, and this focus group was focused mostly on language and how we could make not only our current translations, but our eventual toolkit as equitable and as sustainable as possible. This was focused on things such as the words, or the definitions of important words such as household or family, and get to the nitty-gritty of some of those really, really deep associations that come with them, to ensure that any other groups who use our toolkit in the future can have a deep connective experience with those terms and create an equitable translation. And then our second focus group throughout the semester was far more recent, and this was focused a lot more on actually kind of field testing the toolkit that we put together. So Raina's about to go through some of the resources that we created, both the front-end website and the back-end Google Classroom, but we actually decided to test it out with a group of fantastic undergraduates and some master's students too. We broke them into different groups based on based on the languages that they spoke. So we had a bunch of folks who spoke Spanish, a bunch of folks who spoke Cantonese, different languages working together. And then they actually tried translating some of the questions from the Household Food Security Survey using our methodology. And we got to see what was good about our translations, what our weak points were, and we were able to really build as a result of that. If you want to take it away.
Yep. Thank you, Noah. So based on the valuable information that we've gathered from our precious translation team, as well as the focus group that we were able to host and hold, we were able to put together an accessible toolkit. And so this toolkit has two main components: one, the front-facing website, and two, the Google Classroom. And so for the Google Classroom, let me start with the front-facing website. So for the front-facing website, it contains information about who we are, an introduction to the project, and basically a step-by-step guide from start to finish on how interested students from various backgrounds can make this project into their own and ultimately be able to translate it into any language. And so this website provides the foundational resources on getting started, such as it walks them through the IRB, getting started, finding mentors, finding teammates, as well as securing funding. And for the Google Classroom, that's really where the nitty-gritty work happens. And so the Google Classroom is when students express to us that they're interested and that they're committed to continuing this and adapting this project into their own language, they unlock the Google Classroom feature. And so we send them over the Google Classroom, which we have curated and provided training videos about different aspects of the project, different aspects of the translation process, as well as a thorough introduction of the survey itself, in videos, as well as in assessments, worksheets, checkpoints, just throughout the whole project, as well as reflective worksheets that they can go over together as a team, and so that way they're able to breeze through the entire process together. And so we've created basically all our documents that we've used, all our emails, we have created templates. So these templates have codes that are consistent throughout all the documents. So what we mean by codes is, as you see, such as target language, project name, target population. So these are all adjustable in all the documents so that these group mates are easily able to basically just utilize the Control F function and replace these codes with their own information, and so that it flows together and it's easily accessible by any team that wants to take on this project. And here you see an example of an email that they will be using to find a potential mentor. So in red, you see where they could insert their information and really make it into their own. These codes are very useful, and they can obviously also, of course, have the flexibility to add in their own information, expand upon it. These really just helps to it gives them a foundational work to branch off from. And so our toolkit, we hope for our toolkit that it can be used by future undergraduate student researchers who are similarly interested in translating surveys that measures food insecurity beyond the Vietnamese language. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. We are more than happy to answer any questions you have. Questions for the toolkit team?
This is a comment to all for all three teams and a question added onto it. I am frankly stunned by the amount of work that has gone into this project, the way you've thought about methodology, and also just the steps that the different outcomes you've been able to create out of it. I do some translation as an academic, and I know how painful it can be. So to be able to have done this with basically in the span of a year's time is just phenomenal. Kudos to all of you. I was just, something that stood out to me was the work that you've done is clearly calling for a different perspective on what access means, right? It isn't simply that the survey, for instance, the food insecurity survey should be available in these languages. It's also, and this is really going back to conversations, Man, with you over the last 1 year, it is going into questions of, does this translation make sense culturally, right? Does it mean the same thing to ask, do you have access to food in this way, if that is not the way food is described or discussed in the language and the culture that you're targeting, right? So just based on your work over the year, would you like to comment more on that? Would you like to comment about what are the ways in which you began to think about adapting translation, et cetera, as you did the project?
And this might go back to the technology question earlier too, but something really exciting to share from the cognitive interviews. We still need to do more cognitive interviews, but one of the things that we learn is, so the goal is to ensure that whatever ideas is present in the English version is captured in the Vietnamese version, right? And so the word meals in the English version means important occasions of eating that you would, you would like spend time and do it if you're able to and have the resources to. And to translate that into Vietnamese, the immediate words that come to mind, it's missing something. And I know that culturally because Vietnamese, believe it or not, the gays did not invent this. We have brunch and we have dinner. So we have brunch and we have dinner, right? So brunch is the meal between breakfast and lunch, and dinner is the meal between lunch and dinner. We know that earlier on, but I couldn't prove it because I only one Vietnamese. But when we go out to interview people, immediately people interpret meals as those type of meals. And instead, the words that we have to use in the Vietnamese version back translate to English to something like main meals, right? Versus not just meals alone. So that's something like, that's why it's called like cultural adaptation. And that's why I feel like it's important for someone with that cultural background to do this kind of work rather than technology.
That's all we had time for. But
Yes.